Hi, thanks for tuning in. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. So today we'll start talking about Karl Marx, and in particular, two of his ideas, his analysis and critique of alienated or estranged labor, and the way he thinks about history. So, a little bit of context. Adam Smith, you'll recall, was writing in the late 18th century, during the period in which historians think of as the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Wealth of Nations is published in 1776, the same year, of course, that the American War of Independence begins. So Marx is living somewhat later. He's born in 1818, and he lives until 1883. I like to think of Marx's period as the age of Dickens. He's living in the same time that Dickens is portraying in his novels. So what you see is industrialization, a growing class of workers, and expansion of urban poverty. So a little bit about Marx's life. He studies philosophy as a young man, and after finishing his degree, begins working at writing and editing a radical newspaper in Germany. Eventually his paper is censored by the authorities, and so he resigns and heads to Paris. And it's there that he begins meeting the famous French socialists of the day, men like Proudhon. And that's where he starts getting more and more inspired with this idea of socialism or communism. However, in 1844, he is banished from Paris, and he ends up teaming up with the son of a mill owner, Friedrich Engels, and together in 1848 they write the Communist Manifesto. And so 1848, of course, is this watershed year in 19th century Europe. It's the year when all of these revolutions break out in Sicily, in France, in Germany, in Denmark, in Austria, and Hungary. The revolutions have somewhat different inspirations in different countries. Some are more of a liberal revolt against authoritarianism. Some are more socialist. Some are mainly nationalist. But on the whole, they end in a conservative retrenchment. On the whole, the forces of revolution lose in 1848. And so if you want an analogy of what it was like, it was somewhat like what we've seen with the Arab Spring, this run of revolutions largely ending up with conservative powers still in place. So after the revolutions of 1848, Marx moves to London, and there he's supported by Engels financially, and he begins writing his magnum opus. He begins writing Capital, which he finishes one volume, and he has two other volumes that are incomplete. So the first work we're going to look at is a selection from Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. This is something that he writes at the beginning of his real interest in communism and in economics, but it's something that he never published in his lifetime. It's only published later in the 20th century. But it contains one of his most famous ideas, that of alienation, in particular that modern productive life, especially the work of the laborer, is alienating, or the word that's used in our selection is estrangement. So Marx observes, quite uncontroversially, that capitalism is based on the private ownership of capital, that is, the wealth that's invested in productive activity. But Marx thinks that the mainstream political economists have had a very uncritical understanding of what private property is, in particular where it comes from. So Marx wants to show where private property really comes from. But his project isn't exactly the same as Locke's. He doesn't want to show where private property may have originally come from in the distant past. He wants to show where does wealth come from today? Where is wealth coming from that enables the capitalist to reinvest in more and more productive activity? And his answer is, it comes from labor. In particular, it comes from estranged labor. And so in the process of giving this story about where private property comes from, he's also going to offer us an analysis of different ways in which wage labor tends to be alienating or causes estrangement. I'm just going to mainly use the word alienation because it's easier to use in different grammatical forms than estrangement. But those two things you can read as synonymous for our purposes. So we'll begin with Marx's analysis of wage labor. So Marx thinks that the product of labor is labor that's been embodied in an object. He thinks of the product of labor as, in a sense, congealed labor, as he sometimes puts it. And so the most concrete sense of alienation or estrangement is simply the fact that the worker does not own the product of his labor. Instead, what he makes is something that's owned by someone else, owned by the employer. So the contrast here is with a more with an economy based on independent producers. So the independent producer, the independent craftsman, the independent farmer, whatever they produce, they own, and then they can either use it or sell it as they like. But in an economy based on wage labor, Marx thinks that the product of labor is, on the one hand, it's the result, it's the objectification, as Marx puts it, of the worker's labor, but the worker doesn't own that thing. Instead, the product, as he say, exists outside of him and independently. It exists as something alien to him, and it becomes a power on its own confronting him as something hostile and alien. So the literal sense in which that is true, as Marx thinks of it, is the more the worker is working, the more value he produces, the richer he makes his employer. He's not becoming better off. The harder he works, the richer his employer becomes. And the richer his employer becomes, then in relation to his employer, the weaker the worker is. And so the more the worker works, the poorer he becomes. The more the worker spends himself, Marx says, the more powerful becomes the alien world of object which he creates over and against himself, the poorer he himself. So Marx's picture is one of not cooperation and harmony, as Smith's picture was, but instead one of an antagonistic relationship. The more the worker is putting himself into his work, then the more his employer, the more the capitalist grows in power, and that makes the worker all the weaker. There's an analogy here that's in the background that Marx is thinking about, which is religion. Marx also believes, and he had written this in earlier work, Marx, like other German philosophers at this time, think that, well, there isn't really a God. All that God really is the projection of our own, of what's valuable about humanity up into the sky. And Marx, like these earlier philosophers like Feuerbach, thought that by engaging this projection, we actually diminish humanity, because we take all that's valuable about humanity and project it up into the sky and say, God is great, and we are weak and powerless and corrupt and so on. Whereas what these German philosophers, including Marx, thought we needed to do was realize that, in fact, there is no God. Everything that's good that we see in God is really just a projection of humanity. And so we need to reclaim our dignity and power as humanity by becoming atheists, recognizing that there is no God. So there's a kind of similar dynamic there, in the same way that the religious believer, the more he praises God, the weaker he becomes. Similarly for Marx, the more the worker produces, the more this alien power, that is capital owned by this other person, the more powerful that becomes, and the more that oppresses him. So the literal sense in which there's alienation or estrangement in labor is simply because the worker is alienated from his product. That is, he doesn't own it. It's something that's been alienated. You know, sometimes when lawyers talk about property or contracts or rights, they talk about alienating a right or alienating a possession, which means giving up ownership of it. So there's a kind of similar idea here in Marx, that the most literal sense in which there's alienation in wage labor is that the laborer doesn't own the product of his labor. But there's a deeper sense, Marx thinks, in which the laborer is alienated from the activity of labor. So Marx says, in his work, the worker does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside his work, and in his work he feels outside himself. He feels at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he does not feel at home. So the easiest way to see what Marx is thinking about here is to again go back to the independent producer. Take the independent craftsman, like a carpenter, for example. Marx thinks that the carpenter is able to affirm himself in his work, that by producing quality work, the worker actualizes his potential. He develops his capacities, and he becomes most at home, that is, he's most who he really is in his work. So this is, not in a pejorative way, but a romantic picture of work. That is, it's a picture where work is not just mere drudgery, it's not just the mere necessity of life. This is a way of realizing who we are. This is a way of becoming who we really are. So that's what work can be at its best for Marx. It can be this ennobling activity where we actualize our potential, where we develop our capacities. But that's not what happens, Marx thinks, when you have wage laborers working for someone else. Because now the wage laborer is not producing something. He's not thinking about the quality of what he's producing. He doesn't see himself as a craftsman. Instead, he sees himself as someone who's being employed by someone else to do work for them. He's working for someone else just in order to earn a living, just in order to earn enough money so that he can feed and support himself and his family. And so in the context of wage labor, then work is no longer this ennobling activity. It's no longer has this this capacity for self-realization. If you want an analogy, hopefully not all of you feel this way, but I'm sure some of you have felt before that when you read a book on your own, you're able to really appreciate and enjoy the work. But sometimes if it's been assigned for a class and you have to read it in order to get a grade, it might be harder to really appreciate the reading for its own sake. So whenever you're really forced to do something for some exterior purpose, that can detract from the intrinsic value of the activity itself. So one sense in which the worker is alienated by wage labor is that he's alienated from his activity. And this is connected to a deeper point that Marx wants to make, which is that wage labor alienates the worker from his own humanity. So this is no doubt the most difficult part of this manuscript on estranged labor. So let's see if we can understand what Marx is trying to say. So Marx writes that whereas other animals are conscious of their life and activity only in an individual way, human beings are conscious of their life and activity as something essential to a species. And so in this sense, man is a species being. That is, Marx's idea is that only human beings know that they are representatives of a whole species. They aren't so absorbed in their own individual lives that they don't recognize that they are members of a species. Okay, so that's the first point. Second point, the whole life character of a species, Marx says, its species character is contained within the character of its life activity. So that is a very Aristotelian idea, right? That every species has its own characteristic form of activity. So what is the characteristic form of human activity? Well, Marx says it's free conscious activity. That is, what it is to act as a human being is to act freely, that is, not under necessity, but because one really wants to do so, and to be conscious of what one's doing. We don't act like bees just by mere instinct, going and gathering pollen and building hives and so forth. Rather, we have conscious purposes. And so it's free conscious activity. It's when we engage in that kind of activity that we're most human. So Marx says that whereas lots of animals work, lots of animals produce things, for instance, birds build nests, but an animal generally produces only under the dominion of physical need or under instinct, while man produces even when he's free from physical need and only truly produces in freedom therefrom in that circumstance. So this production is his active species life. So if you want a really good example of this, you have the artist. So the artist is creating, he's conscious of what he's creating, he's not doing it mindlessly, and he's creating freely. He's not creating because he necessarily has to, but because this is what he wants to do. And so again, this romantic picture of work for Marx is that all work should be like that. It would be a good thing if all work had that kind of character. So what happens when you have wage labor? Well, then the object of labor, that is what the worker produces, is the worker sees himself in the product. That is, he sees that this is something he's made, but he also at the same time sees that it's taken away from him. And similarly, he recognizes that he's not laboring in a free, spontaneous way. He's not laboring the way an artist does, or even a craftsman who can take pride in his work and feel as if he's developing his own potential as a craftsman. Rather, the worker sees that he's being forced to work by someone else in order simply to live. So instead of living to work, he works to live. And in doing so, we've reversed the direction, we've reversed the relationship between work and life that Marx thinks ought to exist. And in doing so, we are alienated from our own humanity. Just a very simple, straightforward way of thinking about it is wage labor is not truly human work. It's not work that a human being can feel like a human being in performing, according to Marx. And so the fourth way then in which workers are alienated in wage labor is that they're alienated from other human beings. So I'll just read the passage first and then comment on it. So Marx says, if the product of his labor objectified, is for him an alien, hostile, powerful object independent of him, then his position towards it is such that someone else is the master of this object, someone who is alien, hostile, powerful, and independent of him. If he treats his own activity as an unfree activity, then he treats it as an activity performed in the service, under the dominion, the coercion, the yoke of another man. So what we have in wage labor is not cooperation. It's not as if a number of craftsmen get together to try to make something jointly. Instead, you have a relationship of domination. And wage labor, in the process of wage labor, the worker recognizes that he's working for someone else who controls him. And so he doesn't see his employer, he doesn't see the master as a fellow human being. He sees him as a hostile alien power, something that controls him, a kind of tyrant. So one thing this means is that Marx's, at least in this early analysis of wage labor, Marx's complaint about capitalism is not solely a complaint about poverty. It's not solely the complaint that the worker in capitalist society is poor. And so in fact he says an enforced increase of wages would therefore be nothing but better payment for the slave, and would not win either for the worker or for the labor, for the labor itself, that is, their inherent human status or dignity. Indeed, even the equality of wages only transforms the relationship of the present-day worker to his labor into the relationship of all men to labor. Society would then be conceived as an abstract capitalist. So, just a couple of points about this passage. First, again, the claim is that the deepest problem with capitalism is the relationships that it puts human beings into with respect to one another, with respect to their work. And even if you increase the wages so that everyone was well off, that wouldn't by itself be enough to change the relationships between the worker and his work, between the worker and other human beings like the master. So higher wages wouldn't be enough to preserve his human status or dignity. And even if there was equality of wages, even if everyone in society earned the same income, if we didn't succeed in changing the relationships, then all we would have done is perhaps made the state just one big capitalist. That is, the state would control everything as the capitalist, and all of the workers would work for the state as capitalists. And so the bureaucrats controlling the state would be, as it were, the various capitalists. And so it's a very intriguing passage because it suggests that it's at least one place where you might think that Marx might have been unhappy with the way that communism ended up developing in certain actual communist states. That, the question to ask is, did the revolutions in the Soviet Union, in China, did they succeed in changing the basic relationships of worker to worker and worker to labor? If they did do so, then they would have succeeded to that extent. But if all they did was transfer the capitalist power from these individual capitalists to the state and turn the state into this sort of massive capitalist, then the relationships wouldn't have fundamentally changed. Then human dignity would not have been restored. So that then is Marx's analysis of alienated labor. It's a very fertile idea, one which can be taken in lots of directions. There's also lots of questions that you might have about it. Is it, for instance, based on an overly romantic picture of what work really can be like? Is it does it make it look as if all work is just done for fun? At least the right kind of labor is just done for fun, and whenever you actually have to do something to survive, then it's somehow perverted. You might just think that wasn't a very realistic picture of work. Another concern you might have is, even if there was something right about that, there is something plausible about that romantic picture of work, you could ask, is that romantic picture possible in a modern society with extensive division of labor? That is the problem fundamentally capitalism, or is the problem fundamentally modernity? Is it fundamentally the problem of production on a massive scale? Can production on a massive scale ever restore the kind of relationship between worker and labor that Marx values? So those are certain questions that you might have about the picture of alienated labor. So now I want to turn to our second topic, which is Marx's theory of history. And encompassed under that heading is also his understanding about the relationship between the state and the economy, and also his theory of revolution. So at the very beginning of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, sword and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So Marx thinks that most history that's been written before his time has been quite superficial. It's been about which king conquered which land, which church prelate assumed a certain kind of power. All of that's just surface show. That's just a story about which people happen to win the top jobs in the society. If you really want to understand what's driving society, Marx thinks, then you have to understand the underlying economic forces. And in particular, if you want to understand these underlying economic forces, you have to understand the kind of conflict that they put the different classes into. So, for example, some societies are going to be largely characterized by a conflict between masters and slaves. Some are going to be characterized by a conflict between lords and serfs, some between aristocrats and common people. And you get major changes in society when something happens to that order. So the classic example for Marx is the French Revolution, where the bourgeoisie overthrows the aristocracy and takes command of the society as a whole. So that's what we want to understand when we look at history, according to Marx. We want to understand the basic underlying economic forces. So that's the next thing we'll now take a look at. How do these underlying forces shape the rest of society? So this brings us to Marx's historical materialism. At the basic explanatory level, Marx believes we have certain productive forces. That is, what's really basic from an explanatory point of view and understanding how society works is understanding the raw materials that the society has access to, the kinds of labor that it has access to, and most importantly, the kinds of means of production which are available. That is, the tools, machines, and factories that are available. And these will be defined to a significant degree by the technological level of the society. So Marx thinks that this is what's basic, and certain relations of production arise from particular arrangements of productive forces. So By relations of production, Marx means the economic system. So whether you have feudalism or capitalism, a slave society or a wage-based society, all of these systems which are defined by the law, these arise from particular arrangements of productive forces, as Marx sees it. So his thought is, look, it's no accident that the Middle Ages were defined by a feudal economic system and that the modern world has capitalism. It's not like that was just an accident. Those are the economic systems which were favored by the particular technological possibilities of the day. So if you've got a largely agricultural society, that's going to tend to give rise to something like feudalism. If you have a society which is based on industry and large, expensive means of production, that's going to tend to foster a society in which you have wage labor. You're going to have a capitalist society, Marx thinks. So the economic system isn't just accidental. It's not as if you can just pick whatever economic system you like. The economic system is determined by the productive forces that exist in your particular society. So bottom level of explanation, productive forces, then the relations of production, that is the economic system. And then on top of that, you have what Marx would call the political or ideological superstructure. In particular, you have the state and the dominant values of the ruling class. These parts of the superstructure work to facilitate, maintain, and defend the existing economic relations. So the Communist Manifesto is not the place where Marx best lays out this picture of historical materialism. The classic place is the contribution to the critique of political economy in the preface. But you see in the Communist Manifesto already, you see these ideas already present. So once you see that picture, you can kind of see how things that Marx says fall into place. So for example, he tells us that the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, of course, is the capitalist class, as Marx understands it. The capitalists and the managers who directly serve the capitalists. Again, to take another passage, it's from page 720 in your anthology. Law, morality, religion are to the proletarian so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. So the ruling values of the society, the values that are held by the ruling class, these are particularly the values of the ruling class, not the values of the whole people. And furthermore, why do they have these particular values? It's because they serve their interests, they facilitate their interests. So this is the theory of ideology that Marx presents, that the values of a particular society, its conception of rights and responsibilities, these things are shaped by the interests of the ruling class. So one of the most important things for our purposes about this picture is that it means that Marx is a little bit impatient with traditional political philosophy. He sees traditional political philosophy as bickering about that political and ideological superstructure, as if you could really change anything simply by focusing on rights and responsibilities and so on. Marx thinks nothing changes except in as much as the productive forces change. And so what he wants to do is shift from normative political philosophy and become a scientific economist. And he wants to understand the way in which the productive forces shape everything else in society, shape the political structure, shape the economic. So you might want to ask, well, how satisfying is this picture of historical materialism? Well, I think you have to give Marx some credit for seeing the connections between economic systems, levels of technology, and again between economic systems and the particular formation of the state, the particular values that are held particularly by the elite in society. So you have to give Marx credit, and so this is just one of the foundations, for example, of sociology, is seeing how these things are connected. Now, then there's the further question, did Marx exaggerate the deterministic nature of those things? That is it really the case that a particular arrangement of productive forces always leads to one and only economic system, and that the state is always just upstream, or I should say downstream from the relations of production? That is, the superstructure doesn't really shape the economic system, it just exists to facilitate it and maintain it. That may all be an exaggeration, and it's hard not to see it as something of an exaggeration today when you have capitalism all around the world, but you have rather different political systems in those different societies, and even the economic systems are somewhat different, even if the basic productive forces look very similar. So, for example, what the political system in Canada or in Western Europe doesn't look the same as the political system in Singapore, for example, or in South Korea. So you do have different political systems, it seems like, even though you've got similar economic systems, similar productive forces. So it may have been an exaggeration on Marx's part to think that there was this strict deterministic connection between those things. But again, as I said, there's something insightful about seeing at least the causal connections that exist between them. One puzzle about Marx that arises because of his theory of historical materialism is what he thinks about justice. That is, if morality is just the ideological outgrowth of the existing economic structure, is it really possible to mount a radical moral critique of the economic structure? Can you mount a moral criticism of existing economic structure, of the existing state, if morality is just the outgrowth of a particular economic system? So this is something that a lot of people have been very interested in. There was quite an explosion of interest in this question in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when, after John Rawls writes A Theory of Justice, and American and British and Canadian political philosophers start getting interested in questions of justice again. There's a renaissance and interest in justice, and then people start asking, well, does Marx have a theory of justice? Can Marx play this game that we're playing, or is Marx doing something completely different? Well, so I'm just going to throw out some different interpretations that people have had about this question. So some people think that Marx just thought that we had to get rid of moral philosophy. We have to get rid of normative thought, normative critique, and we just have to replace it with positive science. And the only question is what kind of world in fact is coming. Like when we study historical change, when we study the economics of our society, what kind of world in fact is coming about that we can know about as economists? That's the interesting question, not the question about what world ought to exist. So that's one possible interpretation of Marx. Another interpretation is that Marx, as a person, really believed that capitalism was unjust, but he didn't really want to admit that he believed it, because he believed something like that first interpretation. So this is the way that the Marxist philosopher Jerry Cohen read Marx. He thought that Marx was tempted by that first view, that his positive science was going to replace philosophy. But he didn't really believe it. He just believed he believed it. That's the story he told himself. But in fact, he was really animated all of his life by a deep sense of the injustice of capitalism. So that's a possibility. A third possibility is that Marx is mounting an immanent or an internal critique. Here, the interpretation would be that bourgeois society comes along with certain values, in particular values of freedom and equality. And so we've seen that, for example, throughout all of our social contract theorists, that all the social contract theorists want to understand how can a society be legitimate if all men, perhaps all women, are free and equal. Well, one way to read Marx is he's saying, look, bourgeois society is just not living up to its own values and principles. I'm not going to offer some completely different values and principles. Just if we really take seriously freedom and equality, we're going to see that these things, that these values really aren't realized in capitalist society. So that's a third possibility. Finally, a fourth possibility is Marx might think that the direction of history, which as a matter of fact he believes is moving toward human emancipation, that end point provides an absolute standard of moral criticism. So this kind of goes back to the debate between the Enlightenment historians like Voltaire and the relativists like Herder. Marx is much more of an Enlightenment thinker in this respect. He's more like someone like Voltaire, who thinks history has a kind of direction and we're leading up to something. At least on this interpretation of Marx, he's like Voltaire. And so maybe what Marx's idea is that the end point of history provides a standard by which we can judge how imperfect our own society actually now is. So the last main point to discuss is Marx's view of historical change. So Marx thinks that the means of production on which capitalism is built were generated in feudal society, that the kinds of wealth that capitalism relied upon to be able to invest in such massive instruments like factories and mills, that these that kind of capital, these kinds of means of production, these things were generated in feudal society initially. And what happened, he says, is that at a certain stage of development, the means of production that feudalism produced were incompatible with the feudal relations of production. So feudalism, the economic potential of feudalism, the productive power of feudalism finally outstrips the economic relations that tended to be generated by feudalism. And at that point, the feudal relations of production become bounds or fetters, he says. And when that happens, there's a kind of tension, because now the economic forces, as it were, want to, it would be natural for them to be controlled by a different kind of economic system. So Marx says, the feudal relations of production had become so many fetters, they had to be burst asunder, they were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted in it, and the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. So Marx thinks that if you want to understand the transition from the feudal society to the modern world, the way to understand that is that certain kinds of wealth were built up originally in an aristocratic society, and that wealth was invested in means of production, and at some point those means of production become so powerful that they are no longer suited to the aristocracy in which they were initially fostered. At that point, it's just a matter of time before those relations are going to have to be burst asunder, that they're going to have to be destroyed and something else will be put in their place. So this is Marx's analysis of the French Revolution, is that this is the kind of story he thinks is going on here, that the aristocratic world of the Ancien regime created certain kinds of wealth, certain kinds of capacities for production. At some point, the feudal order was no longer an efficient way for those forces to be involved in production, that the aristocratic order was holding back productivity. And so it was only a matter of time before before the order of the Ancien regime was replaced by something new, by the modern world, by capitalist economy and a representative state. Marx says something similar is going on today. Right now we live in a society where capitalism has created certain means of production, but again, these means of production are getting so powerful that the capitalist's economic order is no longer well suited to facilitate their productivity. And so Marx thinks that something new is coming. In particular, he thinks communism is coming. And so we'll talk more next time about what communism, how Marx thinks about communism, and why he thinks capitalism is doomed to fall. But anyway, this is the way in which historical change happens, is when the productive forces become so powerful that they can no longer be held by the economic system which initially created them. Okay, so that's it for today, and we will pick it up there next time. Thanks. So just to underline some of the main ideas then that I've discussed in this lecture, first we have ideas of alienation and exploitation, that these things are inherent in the capitalist system of private property and wage labor, that working as a wage laborer is necessarily alienating. We had the idea of historical materialism, that economic systems are not chosen but arise from particular productive forces. And we have the idea of ideology. Every economic system produces its own supporting ideology and political structure. These things aren't independent of the economic systems in which they arise. Okay, so we will pick it up there next time. Thanks.